you've heard a lot of examples, you've heard a lot of experience. I'm sure there are many in the room that have had both experience of receiving and providing alternative sources of financing. So I want to throw it open to the floor now and invite comments, questions, asking you to follow the normal pattern, introduce yourself, your organization, but be brief in your interventions if you don't mind. And then I'll also ask the technicians to reset my iPad so that I can pick up the Twitter comments. So hands up for a first comment. Sir.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Dr. Ahmed Al-Sayyad. I'm from Egypt. I have 2 or 3 comments and questions in themselves. I think, first of all...
Please be brief.
Yes, I will. The critical issue that hasn't been addressed is the issue of constitutional right for free education. So if the government finance, it's by law that you need to give free education. So the private monies, alternative finance, etc., will always face this problem. So how is that addressed? That's an issue. It could be private schools, that's fine, that will charge tuition. But if it's for government support, then it has to be free. That's my first question. My second question is regarding the PPP component. It's, again, because of the involvement, the purpose of the PPP has turned in several instances worldwide into facility management rather than PPP in education. The quality of the education, since the same system is choosing the teachers, is doing the education, the private sector is mostly involved with the facility itself. So it turns very much into facility management, which can be a good thing for infrastructure, but not such a good thing for the education quality. My last comment or question is, are education cities worthwhile? I mean, again, with all of these initiatives and problems of legislation and implementation, are collective clusters of education cities useful or not? Thank you.
Education city, very good. I'll take a few more questions and then ask the panelists to respond. 2 gentlemen here in the center, one and one. 2 microphones at the center, please, if we can. Oh, okay, sorry, one over here.
Merci, je vais parler en français.
D'accord.
Mais
I'd like to speak in French. I have 3 points.
Au Dr. BALDEH.
2 for Dr. BALDEH.
Le premier, je ne sais pas si j'ai
The
mal compris.
first,
Je suis ministre d'enseignement supérieur
I'm Minister of
du Congo.
Higher Education of Congo. I heard say that the African Development Bank was more interested in basic fundamental basic education. I'm wondering whether it's not the same mistake that the World Bank made, that only focusing on basic education only. And I hope I've badly understood this. Second, Dr. BALDEH, you spoke about private financing, or additional or alternative, as it's called. There's the NGOs, the private sector, and you spoke about the diaspora. Now, since we are in a session talking about good practices, can we illustrate this? Is there an African country that has actually benefited from this alternative financing or additional financing, including the 3 partners that you spoke about, NGO, private, or one of the 3, if you like? In education, not in general, in education only. And finally, I'd like to say that something about additional alternative financing in my country. There are individuals who participate in financing, who build schools. They are often members of parliament who do this for electoral purposes. What is your opinion? Thank you.
Merci bien.
Thank you.
In the middle, please.
All right. My name is Robert Esprilla. I'm from Colombia, South America, and I work for the Ministry of Interior in Colombia. My job is coordinating cooperation, international cooperation for Black communities in Colombia. I was interested in what Mr. Yero had to say about the possibility that the African Development Bank would work with the diaspora. are you talking about the diaspora, the African diaspora around the world, or the diaspora within content? I'm not sure exactly what you meant by that. Also, wanted to see if the Khan Development Network worked in Latin America, or is it something that's done before in the past, or is something that we're willing to do? And same question for Ms. Wang, Dr. Wang. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. Questions. Yero, I think you had a set of tough questions, so why don't you start? Is the African Development Bank only interested in basic education?
No, okay, let me start. In fact, maybe you, misunderstood me. What I said was, up to 2008, the bank was actively involved in basic education. But from 2008, we shifted the emphasis on higher education, science, and technology. And this is where the bank funding is now. In terms of basic education, we still don't ignore it completely. And we are funding basic education through our budget support operations, which obviously allows the government to invest more in education by making sure that we protect some of the investments that are allocated to the education sector. If we find that these there are very good outcomes that can come out of those investments. So, in a nutshell, the bank's focus now is on higher education, science, and technology. In terms of the African country benefiting from financing, obviously, private sector involvement will be more at the tertiary education, that is post-secondary, instead of at the primary basic education level. So since we started working on this higher education, science, and technology, we've seen some interventions which are involved in the private sector. A typical example is Mali. We recently approved what we call a Mali Digital Complex operation, which obviously makes use of ICT and brings in a multinational cooperation in terms of helping to enhance ICT in the context of Mali's education. We also have other, like African Virtual University, which relies very much on information technology related types of interventions. So increasingly, we are trying to leverage and bring in the private sector to play a more active role in terms of education. Then on the diaspora, yes. Obviously, what I said is that our role for the diaspora is not like the bank working directly with the diaspora. What we do is more of a catalytic role. We help our regional member countries. Because as you know, as I said earlier, the bank programs are country-driven. If a country wants to engage with the diaspora, we help them to develop a strategy or a mechanism so that they can engage the diaspora more effectively. So far, the countries that we've helped have been dealing with the diaspora largely coming from their own countries.
Thanks. Iqbal, do you want to deal with the question of the constitutional right to free education?
Not sure I'm following.
With your microphone.
Thank you. Knew I was forgetting something. I think, there's no argument about that when the Constitution is embedded in the UN Charter of Human Rights and so on, and which is why I think the premise we've taken is that funding of education is primarily the responsibility of government, but that doesn't mean others can't have a role in it. I wanted to comment on this, on your question about the PPPs, and yes, it could be at the level of just facility management, but our own experience has shown that it can be more substantive and more meaningful than that. And let me give you one small example from the northern areas in Pakistan, for instance. For many, many years, actually many, many decades, the only schools that provided education for girls were the Aga Khan schools, starting back in the 1940s before Pakistan was even created. And then in more recent times, the government has established schools for girls and boys. But there was still a gap for middle and high school for girls. We worked with the government in order to put in a second shift, the afternoon shift, where we could then run classes for girls at the middle and high school level. And that's an example of us using the government facility, bringing in teachers and bringing in students actually, who did not have physical facilities to go to in order to leverage them for both. I can go on with examples about teacher training in the same way and teacher accreditation, but there are very many ways to make the PPPs more substantive and more meaningful. So.
A very concrete question about the Aga Khan works in Latin America.
Yes, no, we do not, and I don't think that we have any current plans to expand beyond the areas that we're already covering, which are primarily South and Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa.
Are education cities worthwhile?
I'm really not sure about that. There are a lot of very similar, we call it education parks or education and science and research parks, but I myself, frankly speaking, not so familiar with that. I'm only familiar with a very few cases toward which I hold some critical viewpoint. But actually, I want to go to the question raised by the first commentator, because I really agree with you, and I think it's of paramount importance, especially in developing countries, to enforce commitments of government to financing education. And actually in China, we do have some legislations about how to enforce that. Actually, I myself am called 4% lady among my friends, because in China, number one education finance researchers' question is how to accomplish the so-called 4% GDP goal, which means actually in the late 1980s, the Chinese government, kind of set up this objective increase of public education expenditure to 4% of GDP. So far, we haven't achieved that yet. Anyway, so we made a lot of legislations. And with that, like People's Congress and so on are entitled to make some inquiries, with our executive branches, impose some political pressures. But still, I kind of think it's still very effective, it's still very effective. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've got one question online, which is a tough one. So I'll say, do you think about it, and then I'll give you some time. Of all the different innovative financing mechanisms that are being suggested around the world, which ones do you think are the most sustainable and scalable? So I'll leave that one with you. What do you think? And let me throw it back over to the floor there, please, and take further questions and further suggestions. Yes, microphone here, gentleman here, and gentleman there. So this gentleman here first, please. Please say your name and short question or comment.
My name is Mohammed Diab. I work for World Food Program. I just wanted to ask a very quick question about financing education through taxation, which was discussed earlier. It seems that in each sector in Africa, probably if there are other meetings here on health or on agriculture or whatever, everybody will be going back again and saying, look, this should be financed from agriculture, from taxation. So given the fact that many African resource-poor countries, their GDP, even if you fix 10% for agriculture of your GDP and 4% for education and whatever, that 4% or 5%, depending on the very narrow base of the GDP, will not even be sufficient for funding education. And at the same time, health, water, all kind of sectors are now meeting elsewhere and saying it should be funded by education. From where this is going to be really a heavy burden on an average person, and it is not sustainable, and this in way does not create competitiveness of the sector itself if it continuously basing the finance of the sector on by taxation. I'm sorry I came a bit late, but I don't know. We have not, I haven't seen anybody talking about direct support to the government budget, I mean through foreign aid, to support the education sector. Education sector in Africa is lagging far behind all other sectors, or also there is a major inequality between access to education in Africa and elsewhere. How can we close that gap without really putting a further additional burden on an average African to finance its own education? Thank you.
Great question, thank you. Yeah. Gentleman in the middle here.
Good afternoon, Mr. Desmond and panelists and their public. My name is Heiser Ledesma. I'm from Colombia. This question is for Dr. Noor Ali. Good afternoon. When you say government has the primary responsibility for education, I do agree with you. But are there any international policy to press or obligate governments for finance education in developing countries. Am I clear? Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's great. Nick, I think microphone there, and then one more question down here, and then we'll take another round after this one. Okay, microphone there.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Nick Burnett from Results for Development. I just wanted to comment on this point about the government should pay, which I completely agree with. But what if the government can't pay? Because, and I think we've been talking as if all countries are the same. But countries are obviously at very different stages of economic, educational, and demographic development. And I think it is very, very difficult for, I mean, if we look at the last decade or so, developing countries, and especially low-income countries, have done really well in terms of increasing their spending on basic education. But they now face the need to continue this basic education, essentially primary education, and now meeting needs at secondary level, all at the same time their populations are continuing to expand very rapidly. So this is a huge thing. And I don't think it's as simple, frankly, as just saying, well, the government should pay, because they're not all able to. So I do think, therefore, it's necessary that we think about alternative sources. So, you know, one thing which some people don't like, but is maybe you do have to charge at least people who can pay, at least for some parts of secondary education. I mean, maybe that's not popular, but if that's the only way to do it, maybe you need to think about it. Second thing is about how to get more resources in. So here's where we come to the alternative financing. So things like bonds and so on, there's a lot of potential for these, both domestically and internationally. And thirdly, things, and we happen to be working on some things like this, but things like impact investing, getting people who want to both get some return on their money, or minor return, maybe 1% or something, but at least preserve their money, but also do good. There are a lot of people around the world now who are very interested in this sort of thing. So I think there are several, the point I want to make is that there are 2 points. One, that governments may not always be able to, and under those circumstances, we need to think both about these alternative sources and also, frankly, about things that some people don't want to hear about, which is charging those who at least can pay.
And Nick, just while you got the microphone, do you want to make the point from your previous session that you were chairing about the link between alternative sources of financing and innovation in the sector? Because that was quite an important point, wasn't it, from the previous session?
Sure. One of the reasons that I think there was a question about aid from somebody, and one of the reasons it's hard to attract, seems to be hard to attract more aid or large amounts from new sources like foundations and so on, is a perception, which may seem a bizarre thing to say at the conference on innovation, a perception that education sector isn't innovative enough. And, you know, why should we put our money into that stodgy education stuff? I mean, I know it sounds an odd thing to say at the WISE conference, but that is a real perception out there. So I think that the idea of linking these alternative sources or innovative sources of financing to the promotion of innovation would help deal with not only promoting of innovation, but also deal with that broader image question, which then in turn would probably release more funds from more conventional sources.
Great, thanks. One more question, then I'll come back to the panel. Front here.
3 questions, if I may.
Quickly.
Desmond. Yeah. The first to Mr. BALDEH. I didn't quite get the rationale for why the bank has shifted from supporting basic education to higher education in Africa. I mean, is that based on indicators for education in general in Africa? And I didn't introduce myself. My name is Imad Sabi. I'm from Oxfam, and I represent the international NGO constituency on the board of the Global Campaign for Education. My second question to you, Dr. Wang, is about China. I just want to be sure that I understood you correctly. You said up to 2005, what happened in China is that policies that were followed led to an exacerbation in equity problems in education, right? In access to education. Is that what you were saying? In any case, my question is, what exactly are the differences between the 2 phases as far as you are concerned? And a general question, speaking about alternative finances, of course, one important issue that is being discussed now in connection with the financial transaction tax and other sources. There are ideas, concrete ideas. The working group on innovative financing has put forward proposals on how innovative financing can also be used to support education. So what is your reaction on those kinds also of initiatives? Thanks.
Maybe Rong, we'll start with you then. Firstly, the very specific question on China, but then any other questions that you wanted to answer?
There are huge difference between these two phases, and actually I want to clarify first, which I just mentioned. The first stage can be characterized as diversification and decentralization. In terms of decentralization, that means that the responsibility to finance and operate schools went down to the lowest level of the governments. There are 5 levels of government. Like lowest, like a township, grassroots township government and a county government with very, very limited fiscal capacity. And for the second stage, which I could say re-centralization and the diversification, means that the government appropriations play much more important role in financing education, and also the central government plays a much more important role in financing compulsory education schools. And actually, I have to confess, I think in developing countries, there are not that many alternatives. There are not that many alternatives. And so in the first stage, we really have to rely a lot upon tuition and fees collected directly from students. That proved to be the most reliable source of revenue for our schools. Somehow it really increased dramatically private costs of education. And so for the second stage, and I would agree with that commentator, saying that, and it's like the reform in the education financing regime is really kind of depend upon, the whole fiscal reform, and with the increase of fiscal capacity of government, such education finance reforms only then, kind of could be, successful, could be, talked about. And so we kind of switched, the pendulum in China switched to another side, because now our fiscal revenues of government have been increasing dramatically. So we're now able to draw more upon government sources to finance our schools. Yeah.
Point wrong. I mean, we are increasingly seeing, aren't we, the government of China investing in education, not just in China, but in other countries around the world. Do you see that as a growing trend?
I really don't know, but I have to say, right before I came here, I did some field study in a very remote rural area. Definitely, I do think a lot of our schools are poorly equipped, not adequately staffed with, better trained teachers. And also, when we talk about ICT, and still a luxury for such rural schools. And so I would still insist that our government should continue to increase government appropriations towards our, compulsory education schools, instead of channeling money overseas.
Iqbal, let me turn to you. The question of what if the government can't pay? And in particular, Nick's question of, as governments expand their secondary education systems, should we be looking for alternative financing there?
Well, I think the question directly to me was, are there any international policies to compel governments to pay if they don't pay, if I understood the question correctly. I don't know that there are. I think each government is sovereign. I think that's a question better posed to my colleague from the multilaterals, because they have the levers through persuasion when they help set them the budgetary and fiscal policies to make that happen. But I don't think the private sector can, because as I said, the governments are sovereign after all. I don't see government as being the sole provider of funding for education. I mean, that's why we need these other forms. But the primary responsibility in that sense must remain with governments, who is not off the hook. I think the question that somebody else asked here, what about support from alternative sources for budgetary support to governments? I frankly don't see the private sector putting in money into government budgets. I can see IFIs doing that, they do that already. But I think there are ways that we've seen how you can make the government's budget more effective in the way it is utilized. either through improvement in their own sort of methods of evaluation, in helping them set up good statistical records, in helping the teachers get trained better, and so on and so forth. And also, when you work with government, you end up having some influence over education policy through a demonstration effect. It might take a while, you have to have patience, but when it's proven to be effective, most governments will pay attention to it and adopt it as policy, as we've seen in the case of Pakistan and early childhood development, for instance.
Thank you. Yero, you had some very specific questions addressed to you.
Let me start with why the bank shifted from basic to higher education. I think it's more of a selectivity issue. It's a strategic issue because this happened in 2008. I mean, when the bank commissioned a high-level panel report in terms of where the bank should go in terms of coming up with a strategic plan. And what came out of the report was that yes, education is important and basic education is still important. We need to do something on it, but the bank would have a comparative advantage if they invest in higher education and science and technology, especially in terms of enhancing the competitiveness and productivity of the African economies. So this became the main base for it. But as I said earlier, we are not saying that we cannot support basic education, but we do it through some of our financing instruments, like budget support, by providing additional resources to the budgets of this government, which gives them sort of the latitude to invest more in basic education. And in some cases, depending on the policy reforms that we are agreeing with the government, it could be such that we might even protect those budgetary allocations that are going towards basic education. So
let me come back then to the question online and ask all three of you to give your thoughts on this. So of all the various different kinds of innovative forms of financing that we've talked about here and in other sessions, is there anyone that's jumped out at you as both sustainable and scalable? Any thoughts? Iqbal?
Yes, the first one is speculative because it hasn't been tried in a sufficient volume. And to me, that's blended financing. It is a combination of money that is in equity, in debt, in concessional loans and grants that can help pay the relatively high cost of building the infrastructure for education. And that's not just the physical infrastructure, it's also the soft infrastructure, teacher training colleges, the ICT behind it. And that can effectively reduce the cost of it. So I see blended financing as being sort of a viable way forward that can pay for things like higher education. By the way, I wanted to comment on that. I think I've advocated for many years in Washington that when we only pay attention to basic education and ignore higher education, we are basically saying to developing countries that we are setting the glass ceiling for how high you can go, that you don't deserve to be better educated and create your own leadership. So I'm delighted to hear that the African Development Bank is paying attention to that, but hopefully not at the exclusion of the others. My second point would be what I said before, and I think that is not speculative, that has been proven. We have to create economic growth for countries. We have to expand the pie rather than think about distributing the pie that it is at the moment. Because when families have more access to income, when their incomes grow, more of it goes into health and education. They want to educate their kids. So those are the two sort of ways in which I will respond to that question online.
So blended financing, better economic growth. Yero?
Yeah, I think I agree very much with Iqbal. I mean, obviously, to be more, sustainable and scalable, we need to go into investments that, increases the leveraging effect for some of the investments that we do. And obviously, public-private partnership gives us that opportunity. And also, obviously, in terms of learning outcomes as well, I think they become greater because, as I said, it's not only the financing aspect that you look at, but what comes with that financing in terms of best practices that goes with it. So I think it is a very, sustainable way. But then we don't lose sight of the fact that, obviously, the most predictable and sustainable financing mechanism is the one that is coming from our domestic resources, and this has to be the tax-based, receipts that go into education.
What about diaspora bonds for education? $300 billion of diaspora money flowing around the world. Shouldn't we be tapping into that?
Yeah, but of course, this is, there is a high potential. But we need to make sure that we have the right environment for it at the level of the countries. In some of the fragile states, there is a big motivation for them to go for the diaspora. But we know that they have serious challenges in terms of capacity, but also in terms of, getting the required systems and structures in place to make good use of these diaspora funds. So it's a way of really, the potentials are there, but the challenges to get or help us realize those potentials are great.
Rong, any ideas that are jumping out at you as sustainable and scalable alternative sources of financing?
Yeah, I don't think I have any inspiring ideas. As I just said, especially for post-compulsory education institutions, perhaps you really to be, to some extent, self-reliant. And with more self-reliance, perhaps more autonomy would come. Yeah, that's my point.
We've got 10 minutes left, so I think chance for just one more round of questions. So, gentleman here, and the microphone there, and a microphone here. So, gentleman here in the center. And 1, 2, 3, 4.
Thank you. I'm Paul Kolditz, CEO of the Federation of Governing Bodies of South African Schools, obviously in South Africa. I think my question is to Dr. Wang, seeing as that she mentioned tuition fees. And just a brief context, our constitution in South Africa doesn't make provision for free basic education. It guarantees the right to basic education. But it prohibits discrimination on the inability to afford school fees. So 40% of the public schools in South Africa are entitled to charge school fees, and those who can afford must pay the tuition fees, even for basic education. Is there any evidence that there is a correlation between payment of tuition fees and the quality of the school or the quality of the education in the school?
Thank you. Good question. Sir. Madam, sorry.
Professor à l'université, enseignante et chercheur.
Professor and researcher. In this debate, there's an important issue I don't believe we have addressed, and in which the private sector is taking interest, innovation, research, and the results of education towards integrating the job market. And the funding of research does not exist in developing countries, and the existing resources are dwindling, and this issue has not been addressed. There's another topic I'd like to talk about. When we say that institutions don't impose any conditions, this is not true. The World Bank has imposed primary and secondary education, and countries have complied and have finished secondary school. Now they want to go into university. There are no universities. There's no research infrastructure. So these are various issues that haven't been discussed yet. I do not believe that these alternative funding systems are actually multiple. There's not one panacea here. You need to find different solutions for different countries and different problems. And I believe that this hasn't been taken into account, the importance of funding research.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
Monsieur
Jean-Marc,
l'enseignement supérieur au Gabon.
In charge of higher education teacher in higher education in Gabon. I would have a few questions, cultural questions. First of all, on the issue of development assistance, this is a question for the BAD. We would like the African Development Bank to give us concrete examples of development assistance in the area of education. So, one example in Africa. Second question. About guarantees. are there any legally binding decisions that require monitoring and follow-up of funding in this area? Do you have any guarantee mechanisms, safeguard mechanisms to make sure that the project is finalized? Those are the two questions I wanted to ask.
Please. And I'm afraid we're going to have to make this the last question, and I'll ask the panelists to answer in short term, and then we'll have a sum up. Sir.
Shams Qasim Lakha, former founding president of Aga Khan University, and currently I'm also chairing the board of the Pakistan Center for Philanthropy. I don't have a question for the panel, but I was not able to get any sense from the panel or from the others that one of the most usual form of alternative financing is philanthropy. Now, you asked the audience and the panel about sustainable and scalable. Philanthropy is both sustainable and scalable. The way European and particularly North American education is funded is through a very good proportion coming from philanthropy. I can just speak from my country in Pakistan. Over the last 6 years or 7 years that we have been keeping statistics of publicly listed companies that give money to philanthropy. That has increased by 10-fold in 6 years. And Pakistan is not the most prosperous country in the world. If you look at the center of economic gravity moving east to the developing countries of Asia particularly, there is so much money available to be tapped into for philanthropy. And I'm not saying that all philanthropy goes into education, but I also know that health and education are the two most important attraction areas for philanthropy. So I would simply say, as you look at alternative financing, start talking to the people who have made a little money. They don't have to be multimillionaires to give. They could give maybe $100, maybe $1,000 worth of support every year. And alumni who have graduated from a college or from a school even will give money. So I think, to me, that is a proven source of support we should perhaps look more into. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Perhaps just while you have the microphone, I mean, the topic of philanthropy as a potential source of finance has come up in several sessions the past 2 days, and I think there's a strong feeling that actually the education sector has not been as successful as the health sector, say, has in attracting large-scale investment. You've obviously been successful in Pakistan. What's the secret, do you think? How can we attract more?
The answer is not complicated. Wherever there are people who have made money, nobody ever wants to part with his money because they put a lot of hard sweat and toil and sleepless nights to make that money. So before they give money to me or you or anyone else, they need to be sure that that money is going to be well utilized. Ergo, there is a deficit of trust. Where the deficit narrows and people have confidence in the, let's say, the NGO or the school or the hospital that is going to use their money effectively, there will be much more giving. Okay? Accountability and trust is very important.
Very good answer. Thank you. Back to the panel. I'll leave you to choose the questions that you want to answer. Yero. You had some specific ones addressed to you as the African Development Bank.
I will try to answer the one on the support research, which I think is a very valid observation. In actual fact, the bank's strategy for higher education is one of the pillars of it is for us to support, help in establishing centers of excellence in Africa. And I think we are having to, we have started seeing that happening in some of the countries that we have supported so far. So obviously there is a focus in terms of what do we do to enhance knowledge work in Africa, because increasingly we have seen that obviously even in the international discourse, the African voice is becoming more prominent, and this can even get better if we invest more in research and development in Africa. So this is something that the bank recognizes, and is something that is very central to the bank's strategy for higher education, science, and technology. With regards to, specific examples on some of the higher education, obviously we've supported several. One of them, if I can just mention, is the African University of Science and Technology, which is based in Nigeria and also in Burkina Faso. We've recently also supported Rwanda with an ICT Center of Excellence in partnership with the Carnegie Mellon University. So these are just some of the examples that we are doing in the support of higher education, especially in relation to science and technology as well. I cannot agree more with the observation and comment on the use of philanthropies as an alternative source of financing. And in fact, I think the bank has recognized this, and we are currently in discussion with the Aga Khan Foundation in terms of seeing how we can help, establish, sort of an East African university looking at medical education within the East African region. But sometimes the difficulty is trying to get, as you know, our programs are country-driven. So those discussions are going on, and we are sure that, with the participation of Aga Khan Foundation, we'll be able to leverage the resources we have and reach out to more countries within that region, especially in medical education at the level of the university within that region.
Good, thank you. Iqbal, last answers or last thoughts from you?
I could not understand the questions that were asked in French. I apologize because I don't have the device that translates. So, but I will, and I'm grateful to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Qasim Laka, for bringing up the philanthropy, which is something I was going to say in my concluding remark, but he explained it much more eloquently. I completely agree with that. And it links in also to the factor of economic growth. So in my concluding, in response and conclusion, I would say governments have a role in creating an enabling environment for the private sector to be more effective and to work mutually for mutual accountability and more effectiveness. I think the non-state player needs to be recognized better through research, but also be included in the country strategies and plans that are made, because presently not very many countries take that into account, and after all, they are a contributor to the provision of education, and particularly to improving the quality of education in the countries. So I think they need to be accounted for and have a voice in the country plans and strategies. I think more research needs to be done. I think in terms of new ways of financing and funding, as we heard in the morning session, in the education sector, not very much new has been tried. But that doesn't mean there are no opportunities for doing that. In my mind, the blended financing approach that you just mentioned, which is part of what we are discussing with the ADB and other multilaterals, might well be the way to go. And I think, bottom line, if people have more money in their pockets, especially poor people, they'll spend it on health, they'll spend it on education. So let's not think about education as an isolated sector by itself. Let's think about development in a more comprehensive and holistic way.
Dr. Wang, last thoughts, last answers?
Yes, I want to first of all make a comment on the philanthropy in developing countries. Actually, I myself on the board of a very famous NGO in China, and on that board there's some richest people in China as well as some leading thought leaders in China. I can see, first of all, especially in country like China, we need to have a nurturing policy environment, enabling environment. Like people contribute, they certainly want to have some say over the governance of educational institutions when they are denied such opportunities, and people's enthusiasm would be, kind of negatively impacted. And second, I think that in China also, these philanthropy efforts could be linked with ideology-oriented groups. And sometimes, like they would run into some obstacles. And going back to the question about tuition and fees, I think that's a very, very important question. It's like when we talk about, like education financing in China with especially some Western scholars, they would say, like you're from Peking University or Tsinghua University, two of the top universities, how come you charge such low tuition? And then that means like government subsidize these elite institutions and these kids mostly from well-to-do families. That's so unfair, So I think that is something. That's really some challenge. And going back about how China launched this we call it cost recovery or cost sharing policies, I do think in developing countries, it demands some political will, as well as you have to do it in a very skillful way. In China, usually we have adopted differentiated tuition schemes. For instance, for higher education institutions, at the beginning, we use a two-track tuition schemes. For those whose entrance scores kind of high enough, they were not charged. But for those with lower scores, and they were charged. And gradually, the two-track kind of turned into one track. Every student was required to be charged. And, it's requires some skillful maneuvering in the whole process. Yes.
Thanks very much. Sadly, we're going to have to finish there for now because time has run out. But just to say thanks to you in the audience and those online that have sent in questions, and thanks particularly to the panel for a great discussion. I think we got lots of ideas and lots more questions to ask. But please just join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.